Okay, right now I am with LUCIE POHL.
Hello.
She is the host of the Immigrant Jam Podcast, which also has a comedy show, the Immigrant Jam Comedy Show, is it?
Yeah.
And I'm going to be performing on October 7th.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
I can't wait.
Apaan?
Narasi bang. Monolog.
Monolog. Males. Terakhir gue pernah bikin kayak gitu, COVID malahan. Udah yang penting orang udah tahu nih. 4 Desember 2022, Istora Senayan Jakarta. Tiket masih ada di loket.com. Udah. Gitu dong. Cukup.
Nggak ada bang. Doa bang.
Nggak ada. Ya ada sih, bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
Proklamasi.
Kenapa proklamasi?
Puisi.
Nggak ada puisi. And we just did a podcast episode, where it was one of the most interesting. It's so fun to be on, and so thank you for
doing it. I'm so happy to have you on, to meet you. I'm so happy that you and your family moved to New York. I love that New York is still attracting the best people from all over the world to come here. So.
Well, the best, I don't know, because the thing I realized about being in New York, I met a lot of people here in New York who doesn't even speak English, but finds a way to hustle, to survive, to have a career. Some Indonesians, I don't know if I should say this, but some Indonesians started out in New York doing shady things, like illegal things.
Okay.
But then I don't know what happened. Now they're an accomplished businessman with so many restaurants or
now
stuff.
They're in politics.
And so this is a content I have on my YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Where this is just basically me having an excuse to get to know to someone new, especially in the comedy scene.
Yeah.
And I really love you guys should. There's also a YouTube channel, right?
Yeah, I started putting the videos up on YouTube. Yeah, so check
it's
it
LUCIE
out.
POHL.
It's LUCIE POHL. Yeah.
Yeah, so episodes of the Immigrant Jam Podcast. is there, and it's very interesting because Lucy gets to talk to. Is everybody comic there or?
No.
Oh, no.
So it's mostly comics. I would say maybe like 75% comics at the moment. That's just because that's most of the people I know too. But I've had a composer on.
Oh, wow.
I've had a few writers on. I had an actor on. So yeah, there's a little bit of a mix.
It's very interesting because we get to learn a lot about not only about cultures, but about how they perceive New York City from the podcast. And so I'm excited to be on the podcast. So be on the lookout. Yeah, it's also on other than YouTube. It's on
iTunes, Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts, you
Okay.
can find the podcast. And if you can't find it somewhere, then let me know and we'll fix that. But yeah, it should be on everything.
Right. Okay, so I like to get to know a person from way back, even before doing comedy. So you were born here?
No, I was born in Germany, in Hamburg, Germany.
Hamburg.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was 8 years old when we moved here. My dad is German and my mom is a Romanian Jewish Romanian.
So for work, your family moved to New York for work?
Not really. Actually, no. My parents are both artists. My dad's a writer and an actor, and my mom's a singer. And they moved here kind of like you guys because it was their dream. Because they both had, they're post-war kids. And obviously, post-war in Germany or in Europe is a loaded thing.
Yeah.
So they both had this dream of leaving Germany and of getting out. And, my parents both have like very intense histories. And so my dad wrote a couple of plays that were really successful in Germany in the early 90s. Wow. And they had a little bit of money, like you were saying on the podcast, saving money to try to move somewhere. And then they thought they'd like to go somewhere for like 6 months to a year. That's also a very common like immigrant story that people say, oh, we're going to check it out for 6 months or a year here in New York. And then you never leave because...
That's also my story. I told everybody, I feel like I'm gonna be in New York for 3 years and then we'll see.
Right.
But yeah. I'll probably never leave.
That's what happened.
So when you move here, I'm guessing it's really hard for an 8-year-old because culturally it's different, right? I don't know how it is in Germany at that time. What year was this when you moved?
At 92.
92.
Yeah.
What was it like in Germany, in Hamburg in 92?
So it was very peaceful and comfortable, and Hamburg is one of the like wealthier cities in Germany. So it's a really nice city. I had all my little friends, and I was kind of very happy there. And so I didn't want to go at all. I hated it. I didn't want to go. I couldn't speak English, not a word of English, because I don't think you start English classes in Germany till like the 5th grade or something. And I was in 4th or 3rd, then 4th when we got here. And my dad always tells me the story that when he told me that we were moving to New York, I said, how can I move to New York? I don't speak English. And he was like, you're going to learn it. And I didn't believe him. I was like, no, I'm not. What are you talking about? I can't learn English.
Right.
And so we made a bet. Now I'm dating myself. I mean, now it's 92 because I said if I win, so if I don't learn English, you have to buy me a new game for my Game Boy.
Oh, those were the years, Game Boy. Yeah. Wow.
And so obviously I lost, but my dad tells me that like a year after we got here, I stopped him once and I said, Dad, I wanted to say thank you. And he said, why? And I said, for not lying to me.
Wow.
So, and he was like, what are you talking about? And I was like, because I speak English now. The funny thing is that I learned English, but my dad still doesn't speak English. I always say my dad is the OG woke man because he's been calling everybody they for 30 years. He just calls everybody they.
It's so interesting to me because I always, not a lot of them, but I always find fascinated every time I see immigrant who moved into New York at a certain age, but now has a very New York accent.
Yeah. That's true. I do have a very strong New York accent, and it comes out even stronger around New Yorkers. Like all of a sudden, you'll hear me talking like this. You know? I think, and a lot of people ask me, say like, you sound like you're from Brooklyn, you know? I never lived in Brooklyn. I grew up in Manhattan. I grew up in downtown Manhattan. But I think that it's actually like an over-assimilation because you want to fit in so badly, you know?
Yeah.
And because you have to like listen so carefully, I guess, subconsciously as you're learning the language.
Yeah.
You take it on even more strongly than like a native. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. At what age do you suddenly realize, whoa, wait a minute, I have a New York accent? Because I'm also a fan of Gary Vee. He's from Belarus, but he sounds so like from a New York, from New York. And I was like, at what age does he finally, develop an accent? Do you remember yours?
No, I don't. I mean, I know that I remember people, like when I was a teenager, starting to be like, wait, are you Puerto Rican? Because I kind of would talk like this a little bit and like a little faster, and it would sound a little bit like I had like a Puerto Rican twang to it to some people.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, what? No, I couldn't be further from Puerto Rican. I'm like, my mom's Romanian. Maybe they're the Puerto Ricans of Eastern Europe, you know? But no, I don't remember it at all. I think that's because though I was around New Yorkers all the time, you know? And I have a friend from high school I see every like couple of years because he moved to Colorado. But when I see him, it's over. Like we're talking like truck drivers from fucking the Bronx. You know what I mean? Like it's so
that's
funny.
very interesting. Where was the first, I don't know what the word is, but at one point in your life, there's some sort of inspiration that gave you the idea that maybe you could be a comic? Was it always a thing, or you kind of like accidentally become a comic, or if that's the word?
Well, because I grew up in a family of performers, I always wanted to be a performer, or I always thought that was like a totally normal thing to do. Like it wasn't weird to me, you know? So I always wanted to be a performer. I was always funny and I always made people laugh. When I was a kid, people would laugh all the time and I would get upset. I would get really upset. Like I would cry and I would always tell people to stop laughing, which of course makes people laugh.
They're laughing
more.
at the things you say.
I'm saying or doing, and I would get mad. Like it really bothered me. And then I wanted to be an actress. So I started doing a lot of acting when I was like a teenager and adolescent, even here in school and stuff. And then when I was 18, I graduated high school here and moved to Germany to study acting there because it's free as a German citizen. And I always kind of like suppressed that like funny side because I always thought like, oh, I have to be a serious actress. And this is something that comes naturally to me. And I always made people laugh. I always had jokes, you know, always doing like characters and stuff. But I kind of like put that aside. And I think that there was a lot of also like this thing about like being a female and like needing to like be, you know, beautiful and do you know what I mean? I wanted to be that, and like not that I didn't like comedy. Monty Python was always like my religion. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I think that there was a lot of a period where I was kind of like suppressing that and kind of struggling with like what I thought I should be and am not enough of. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then I came back to New York and started doing some sketch comedy with a friend. And I really loved that. And then people would always be like, you should do stand-up, you should do stand-up. And I was kind of like, again, it was like, took it for granted. It was kind of like, oh, I don't need to do that. I need to do something else. But then I started writing one-person shows, and they were funny, and people were laughing. And I was like, why are people laughing? This is sad. And then I started so I kind of came into it like that. So I started by doing like 1 hours. Like I didn't start with doing like 5 minutes. I started with doing 1 hours. But not exactly stand-up. It had elements of stand-up, but it was...
But it's a one-person show.
Yeah, it was more storytelling and characters, you know, like acting everybody out in the scene and stuff like that. And it had stand-up elements in it. And then I wrote another show, and so the first show I took to the Edinburgh Festival. Oh, wow. Yeah, and that like changed my life, and it put everything into perspective. And suddenly I also found my people. Like I was hanging out with comedians and I was like, yeah, now I feel.
Wait, so you went to Edinburgh Fringe Festival not as a comic, but as a one-person
With a comedy, in the comedy section.
in the comedy section,
Yeah.
but it's a one-person show.
Yeah. So it was a one-person show. I wasn't mic'd. I did it,
Wow.
like very theatrical, but it was just me in a chair. And it was called Hi Hitler. Hi Hitler. Hi.
Wow.
Because as a kid, I was like obsessed with Hitler. And I thought he was like this funny man, and I thought he was holding up a peace sign, and I thought what people were saying back then was Hi Hitler. I thought it was a greeting. So it was like about my growing up and my kind of roots and being a German Jew and the sense of like never fitting in or belonging and like, having that in your DNA, like the displacement and all of that. And so I did that, and then I did a second show that was all characters. And then I did a third show that was more stand-up. And then I started doing this show, Immigrant Jam, the live show, with stand-up comics. And I would have character comics and stuff like that too. But then I started getting more and more interested in like the art of stand-up and the like science of it and really, kind of diving into it and learning it, and then I started going to open mics, which I hated, obviously, because it's the worst thing in the world.
I think New York's open mic are different than open mics in other cities, because I met
Probably.
comics from outside New York, and they're also weirded out by the fact that there are no audience.
Yeah, it's really bad here. I mean, the open mics are painful here. Everybody says that. Everybody knows.
But then you started doing open mics.
I started doing open mics, but I was like, oh my God, I don't want to do this. Like, I do not want to do open mics. And I was a little bit arrogant because I was like, I've already written like 3 1-hour shows. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I went to Edinburgh and I've toured in I've done my show on the West End in London.
I don't need this bullshit.
It was kind of like a defense mechanism,
see.
because it's so painful.
It
so
is.
I was, instead of being like, you know what, I need to go through this, I was like, I don't need this. And then, but then sort of the fourth show that I wrote, I started paying even more attention to actually writing bits and, really like crafting a joke and stuff like that. And so that's kind of how it evolved, how I got here. Then during the pandemic, I just did so many like outdoor shows. And now, before the pandemic, because I do this voice on this video game, I used to travel a lot to ComicCons. So I didn't have a lot of time to do a lot of shows here. But since the pandemic, I've been able to just be here.
Right.
And you know how that is, how important that is to be in one place if you're working out stuff. So that's been really good.
Yeah. Back in Indonesia, the stand-up comedy scene in Indonesia basically it started out 2011.
Wow.
It's very new. There were people doing stand-up before.
Yeah.
But it's not even 10 people.
Wow.
Prior
Still?
to
Oh, prior.
to
Okay.
2011. Traditionally, in the Indonesian comedy tradition, there are one-person comedy, but it wasn't mentioned as stand-up. Stand-up blew the scene in Indonesia in 2011, and so it's relatively new. But it's all over Indonesia. But female comics in Indonesia is still, I guess, 1 out of 10. And it's hard for them because, especially Indonesia, because most of Indonesian comics are asshole perverts. Female comics, they wanted to work their material in open mics. There's always going to be assholes, catcalling or approaching her. Hey, yo, you want to go to my place or something? They were like, I'm here because I want to do stand-up. And so, but coming here to New York, there's a lot of female comics, even though it's not, not comparable with the amount of male. But was it different? Was it tough being a female doing in the comedy scene in New York?
So in the beginning, especially the open mics, yes, I remember that. It's funny because what people sometimes don't think about is that men can give women a hard time, but other women also give women a hard
I
time.
see.
You know, sometimes, especially if you're new to a scene or something. And so I felt that energy from men and women. You know, it was like the men, you know, either, like you said, like want to sleep with you, or they
Basically
feel
insecure with
some
the,
insecurity, exactly, for whatever reason. And then the women sometimes have the same because they don't know you, or because maybe sometimes people think you're funnier than them, or you're funny at all, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or they think you're not funny, so they don't want you around, you know? So in the beginning, for sure, that was hard. But for me, luckily, I guess, because I had other things in my life that I had already kind of worked on, and things that made me more secure just in myself in general, I was able to deal with it a little bit better. But I think like the sexism or the shit that women have to deal with is, you know, that's what we kind of realized during the Me Too movement, is that it's in every industry and every corner of everything, that women always have to deal with this type of thing. So I do, and I do think that the stand-up scene, especially in New York, it is very cliquey, you know, and I really don't like that. But I didn't like that in high school.
Yeah,
I wasn't
cliquey.
like that.
You mean by cliquey? You means that
Groups.
Yeah, groups.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you see certain comedians doing all the shows.
Yeah.
And you're like, why are they doing all these shows? And it's not necessarily because they're the best. It's because they hang out at the right places. It's because they are
I have a sense of that too.
right.
Kind of
They're
feel.
part of the cool kids club.
Yeah.
And I never did that, sort of played those, participated in those games even in high school. Do you know what I mean? Like I was always friends with everybody or
that.
nobody. Yeah. But I think, again, that's also part of the entertainment industry. A lot of the entertainment industry is, as you know, networking, and you can choose to say, I'm going to do that, or you can choose to say, I'm not going to do it. It might take me a little bit longer to get where I want to be, or it might need a different route, but, you know, I don't think it's...
Some people would think of that a route as a hack, you know?
Maybe. I mean, you know, at the end, who cares what other people do, I guess. But I did have a hard time in the beginning, kind of not being sort of resentful about that always. And that kind of, it did stop me in the beginning from going to open mics more, or trying to hang out at shows more, because I was kind of like, I don't, you know, people are just kind of assholes in a way.
Yeah.
I was in Australia in June with Tom, and we did shows at the Comedy Store there, which is like the biggest comedy club in the country in Sydney.
There's a comedy store in Sydney?
Yeah. So that's
the same comedy store,
no,
or just
it's
different?
just the same name.
Oh, it's the same name.
But it's the same, the biggest comedy club in the country.
Right.
And so obviously it's like the best comedians in the country performing there, and they let us do spots there, and the comedians were so nice. And Tom and I were both like, holy shit, people wouldn't be like that here. You know, I guess also because there's so many comedians here, because it's so competitive here, you know. But I think that is something that, like, it's hard to find, like, or it's not hard to find, but there is a lot of, like, bullshit you have to kind of comb through.
Yeah, I've only been here since January this year. I already realized that this is going to be very hard to break into. Like, I know it's, being in New York is like, a lot of people ask why New York, and I was like, well, there are so many open mics in a day, 20 to 30. I need to own my skills, but I also need to feel, I always watch, every time I go to an open mic, I always end up being there at the end, till the end, I mean.
Oh, wow.
Because I want to hear them. A lot of comics, they leave.
They leave
after,
right away, yeah.
Yeah, and I always feel bad to the last comic, because there's only the host, him, and someone else. Most of the time it was me. But I feel like I need to hear, because it's rhythm-wise, it's different in New York. It's more, how do I say it? It's more, I don't want to say jokey, but it's set up in punchlines. It's just straight jokes. Whereas in Indonesia, if you see my clip doing stand-ups in Indonesia, I'm more theatrical. I have more facial expression. When I moved to New York, I feel like everybody's just talking here. There's not everybody's like Matthew Silver, but Matthew Silver is a legendary street performer.
Yes.
But I feel like it's so different. But apart from that, I feel like it's hard to be a part of.
Well, I think that's also partially, Tom and I talk about this a lot, and I think partially it's also like in New York, the scene almost like wants you to put in your hours. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
They want to see that like you're serious, or they want to see that like you are willing to give it something.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It almost feels like that because there are a lot of people that come around and then they disappear. You know what I mean? And I think that once you are in, or once you have found your group of people, like they are super supportive, and there's a lot of like amazing, great people, you know? At the same time, I feel like it's always important to remember that, you know, a lot of people that are drawn to this industry in the first place are people that are, you know, and not everybody's like that.
Makes
but
sense.
of course there are a lot of those. So a lot of people will look at you only to see, what can I gain from this person? Like, what, you know, do you have a show that you run that you can put me on? Do you have a podcast that you run that you can put me on? Do you have a YouTube channel? Do you know what I mean? Like, people are gonna like look for that, unfortunately. Or a lot of them, but not everybody. I think though that like going to open mics, for example, and doing what you're doing, you don't need to do that. Like, you know that, right? That you don't need to do that.
I
you
guess
need
so.
to for yourself, and
Yeah.
but I'm saying like you could easily also just message people and be like, "Hey, I'm like huge in Indonesia." You know what I mean?
Yeah, I understand.
So the fact that you're doing that, I think people will see that and respect that a lot.
Yeah,
Do you know what I mean?
I realized that. I don't know if this is actually a good thing. I feel like it's a good thing, but now that you mentioned it, I realized, this is like 2 to 3 months in, I realized how serious New York comics are in doing stand-up, because they get offended. Some of them get offended every time they, you know how at open mics, there's always someone who's having a birthday and their friends challenge him or her to do a stand-up for her birthday. And then they go on stage and they're always, you know, loud amongst themselves.
Right.
And then, this is me doing stand-up for the first time. I'm doing this because it's my birthday. And there's always comics who are snarky at those kind of people. And like, so to you, this is just like a challenge. For me, this is my whole life. I was like, wow, people are offended. With, you know, that's how serious they are. Because I was like, this is my whole life and you're doing this just for fun. I was like, wow, people are serious in New York for doing
That's
stand-up.
hilarious.
Yeah.
Well, I think though that I know exactly what you mean, and there is like a sense that bothered me, for example, for a long time. That's like kind of was like a little bit this arrogance that stand-up comics had here, where like for me, for example, what I got a lot of in the beginning was like, oh, you do one-person shows? Oh, okay, so you're just less funny. So you just tell stories that aren't, you can't do stand-up because you're just not as funny, so you have to tell stories that sometimes are funny, you know?
Yeah.
And now it's actually changing because a lot of stand-ups are doing these types of shows. You know, Mike Birbiglia helped change that, but like all of them, Neil Brennan is doing those shows, you know, you name it.
Yeah.
They're all doing these 1-hour shows.
Yeah.
And more and more stand-ups are sort of also in their specials moving away from like joke to something that has more of a narrative and more of like a through line, you know, beginning, middle, and end to it, and is more gratifying to kind of watch as an experience or whatever. So I think that that's like also slowly changing. But I mean, I think, a lot of people are, because they like go to 5 open mics a night and are running around the city and are putting in everything. They see somebody that, you know, gets a laugh without doing all of that. They're like, fuck that guy. You know what I mean? Like,
But there's always people like that on every industry, right?
I think so too. I think so too. I do. I think so too. I think that like I said, it just sometimes attracts a few more people that, are want to be famous or are like narcissistic and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I do think also New York can be very rewarding in that sense, because you do get to watch people very close, like in very close proximity, do their thing. Do you know what I mean? Because there's so many shows.
Yeah.
You're like rubbing elbows with everybody.
Yeah.
And that's what's also so unique about New York, because in LA you drive everywhere and people live far from each other, but here you're taking the subway together and you go to one show together, and then a person will be like, hey, I'm going to another one, want to come?
Yeah.
Then you go there, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And
Yeah, it's very interesting.
so, yeah, it is. It's very unique. It's like this whole ecosystem, the comedy world here.
I want to touch on your podcast and your show, but before that, you said that you're also a voice talent for video games, a very famous video games, which gets you the opportunity to go places for Comic-Cons. I don't really play games, I'm sorry, but
That's okay.
I don't either. Where did the opportunity come to you, and which video game? Because it has to be, you must be very famous. I mean, a lot of people who are playing these video games, they probably are huge fan of yours.
Yeah, so the video game is called OverWatch.
I know OverWatch. I've heard of it. I don't play it.
So that it came out in like 2016, 15, 16, and it was a huge hit. It was one of the most played games in the world.
Still is, right?
Now it's still popular, but they're coming out with Overwatch 2 actually next week. So the original Overwatch is not going to be available anymore to play. So we'll see how Overwatch 2 does.
Which character are you voicing
My
for?
character's called Mercy.
Mercy.
So she's an angel. She has big wings and a halo. She can fly. When the game first came out, she was a really, really popular character because she could resurrect the whole team as the angel. And her catchphrase is, "Heroes never die."
People must be, they're out of their minds right now if they play Overwatch.
Yeah.
How did you get the opportunity?
So I was, I had a voice acting agent, especially because I speak German. That made the competition a little smaller for jobs here and stuff. So I had an agent, and then Blizzard, the company that makes Overwatch, was looking for a native German speaker for the part, because she's Swiss, so she speaks German, the character. And then I auditioned, and I had no idea, no clue. I auditioned.
That was going to be like that?
I knew nothing about video games. I mean, I played Game Boy when I was a kid, but that's it. Knew nothing about, they make World of Warcraft and Diablo and those games, but I knew nothing about any of that. I auditioned. My agent was like, "Oh my God, congrats!" I thought, "What is wrong with her? Why is she so happy?" And it's only $1,800. You know what I mean? It's not like I'm set for the rest of my life.
Yeah.
And it was like one session. So I was like, okay. And you don't get residuals on video games. So I was like, what's the big deal?
It's 1 day work, you saying?
It was 1 day work.
Wow.
Yeah, it was kind of like in the beginning. And then in the recording session, the director said, this is going to be a really big deal, right? And I was like, in my head, I was like, ugh, these Americans.
They're always saying that.
Yeah, exactly. Why are they always saying that? Everything is a big deal here, I was like, oh, here we go. Yeah, right, whatever. And then the game came out, and then I was invited to a ComicCon in Atlanta. And I had been to a Comic-Con before because I did this popular show in the UK called Red Dwarf, which is with a sci-fi comedy, and it's really, really popular. So they invited me to a Comic-Con, but it was like maybe 500 people, and it was in a small town in the UK. And so I kind of knew what a Comic-Con was, but this one was in Atlanta. It was called MomoCon, and I thought, oh, this will be interesting. I got there, and it was like insanity, like thousands of people, like insane, lines of people. And they came to my table, and people were crying and shaking and couldn't believe they were meeting me. And I was like, what is happening? I'll never forget, a group of deaf boys came to my table with their cousin who wasn't deaf. And he was like, oh, they're deaf, but they're so excited to meet you. And I was like, they can't even hear my voice. And they're, just because I'm that character for them, and it was so, I went up to my hotel room and cried for like 2 hours because I was so overwhelmed, you know, like I couldn't believe it, like what's going on. And also I was making all this money that I didn't expect, and it was so crazy and strange. And then people like started recognizing us, the cast, like out in public. And Rolling Stone wrote an article that with the title "Overwatch: What It's Like Being the Beatles of Voice Acting."
Wow. That is amazing.
Crazy. And then I started getting invited to Comic-Cons all over the world, and I've done like over 60 Comic-Cons and been to like, you know, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, everywhere in the UK, Hawaii. I'm going to Costa Rica next month for a Comic-Con.
Wow. It must be weird to be such a superstar in one industry, but then when you go back to doing stand-up, you have to, you know, come at an open mic and bomb and, you know, go through all this bullshit.
I actually wrote my fourth show was all about that, because until recently I lived in the East Village in a very typical old school tenement style apartment where the bathtub is in the kitchen. So you don't have a separate bathroom. You have a toilet that's separate. But you don't have an actual bathroom.
Wow, the bathroom is in the kitchen.
The bathroom is in the kitchen, people.
That really sounds like traditional Indonesia, to be honest.
Really?
Yeah. But wow.
So I moved out in May, but so I was living this life where I would get invited to these Comic-Cons, and I was treated like a celebrity. Like they would pick me up in an Escalade.
Wow,
I would get flown first
crazy.
class, like even to Abu Dhabi, like.
That's
Business
crazy.
class, you know, like crazy. Best hotels, like huge hotel rooms, green room. I would be sitting at a table with, you know, you name it, like the Incredible Hulk and I don't know, whoever you can think
It's
of.
surreal,
you know?
right?
Yeah, and then I would come back to New York, and the Escalade would drop me off in front of my building, and then I'd have to carry my suitcase up 3 flights with like dead cockroaches and stuff, and go into my apartment, and then the bathtub was in the kitchen in a tiny place, and so...
Snap back to reality.
Yeah, so I wrote a whole 1-hour show about that, about this like, you know, juxtaposition between, and that's a very like modern phenomenon of the time we live in, where you can be this like celebrity in one world on social media or whatever, but it doesn't reflect on, it doesn't have any meaning of what's going on in your real life.
Yeah,
you know?
I understand. Yeah. So what makes you still do everything else? Because it sounds like you made it in the video game industry, but you're still doing the Immigrant Jam, which is amazing. The Immigrant Jam Podcast, the Immigrant Jam Show, you're still doing comedy. Is it because it's not something that you actually wanted to pursue, you know, voice acting for video games? Like it's even though, no matter how big you are, it's not the dream, or...
I think, first of all, live performance has always been my favorite thing in the world, always, and I would never want to give that up. That's why I think during the pandemic I did a Twitch show, which was a live stream, because I love this like feeling of this like shared experience that only happens in that moment, and that is an exchange between you and the audience, or you and the people that are in the room or space together, even if it's a virtual space. And so that's one. And then probably I'm crazy. No, and then I don't know if it's not the dream. I also think that, you know, it's always like people kind of have this perception of like you have made it or whatever, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. It's, you know, it's not like that, you know what I mean? Especially in this industry, like you have a victory and then
it's always on to the next one.
Yeah, it's always on to the next one, and it's always also you have to fight for the next one again, you know. And I mean, I don't know what it feels like to be, you know, Brad Pitt, but I think he has to fight too, you know what I mean? And like,
that makes sense.
You know, I'm not in the place where people are calling me and going like, do you want to be the lead in this amazing new video game or not? Because we're holding it for you. I still have to like compete and fight. And so, for example, one thing that I really want to do more of is animation work. And that's very hard to get into, especially if you're in New York, because most of the work is in LA.
In LA.
So I've made like a little progress with that. I worked on a really awesome project this year, but I'm still, you know, I was taking lessons and coaching for that. And I'm still, you know, making my way. And I think my dream is definitely to be able to do it all, you know.
Yeah.
That's definitely my dream.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's why I'm still doing everything.
It's always interesting when you there's, especially in Indonesia, there's this notion that when you do something, that's the only thing that you should do all your life. Like like you're put in a box, and if you say this is you, then you should be like this.
Right.
Where it doesn't have to be like that.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you don't stay in that lane, because I feel like the Immigrant Jam podcast especially is very interesting. There's so many podcasts.
Yeah.
So many podcasts.
I know. Millions.
Yeah, but you're different in a sense that the questions you ask and the stories people tell, you don't really see that in a lot of podcasts. Because I think it's because the biggest podcast is always like monologues or interviews, but just random stuff. And just, if you're a comic and you have podcasts, all you have to do is just make people laugh or whatever. So it's thoughtful, the podcast. And you told me that it was actually a podcast first and then the comedy show.
Other way around.
The other way around.
It was a comedy show first.
And then you realized that, why don't I make a podcast out of this? Right. And so how did the first show, you know, came to fruition?
The live show?
Yeah, the live show.
So in 2017, Donald Trump was president. Ever heard of him, people? But
he goes to Indonesia to play golf.
Yeah, exactly. Ugh. So in 2016, obviously he was elected, and then in 2017 he became president. And I was living in Astoria, Queens, and watching his one of his first speeches after the inauguration. And for the first time in my life, and I know that comes from definitely a place of privilege, but I'm just being honest, for the first time in my life as an immigrant, I felt like afraid because I wasn't a citizen then yet. So even though we moved here when I was 8, my parents, it's like a long story, but I only became a citizen like last year. So I was still on a green card. And there was a lot of questions around what he was going to do with immigrants in general. It was a time of sort of panic and insecurity about, I had been on what was then called Obamacare, which was the government subsidized healthcare. I was on that for a little bit. And there was, in the beginning, Stephen Miller and Donald Trump were talking about, blocking the path to citizenship for any immigrant that had ever taken advantage of government programs. And so for the first time in my life, I felt like, what's going to happen? Am I still going to be able to live in this country? And it made me so angry that he would do that to people, that that he would make people afraid, for no reason. And at the same time, this place called QED in Astoria, a comedy club,
that place,
put out a post on Facebook and said, we're looking for producers to produce new shows and stuff. And it was in my neighborhood and where I was living at the time. And so I thought, okay, I want to do a show there. I just moved to this neighborhood. And then I just had this idea of because I feel this fear and this anger, I want to do a show where I celebrate immigrants, where it's about immigrants, where it's about having a space where having an accent is amazing and telling your story. And in the beginning I said, anybody can that was my policy in the beginning, that anybody could come do the show. I never watched people's tapes. If somebody asked me if they could do the show, I said yes. And so I had a lot of bad people on. Not bad, but inexperienced.
Yeah.
And other comedians, Tom, always made fun of me because he was like, how are you booking this show? But here's the thing. It was always a great show. Even if people bombed, even if people weren't I mean, I said I had a lot of bad people on it, and that's not true in the sense, like, whenever I did the show, people afterwards, if there was 2 people in the audience, 10 people, 60 people, it didn't matter. People were like excited, and me watching it, it was always like you got like a little trip around the world, and it was so cool because even if the comics didn't do immigrant material, which not all of them do, you still got a different perspective.
Yeah.
Because of where they were from, or their parents, or how they grew up, you know, with immigrant parents, or with the experience of having immigrant parents, of having to translate. There's a comedian who I had on the podcast called Dan Rosen, who's really funny, and his dad's Persian and his mom's Israeli. And he was talking, and he was talking about how he feels that, you know, part of why he became a comedian probably is also because he grew up cross-culturally. He always had to have an outside view, and that's kind of what comedians do.
Yeah.
They zoom out, right?
Yeah.
Or I mean, they zoom in sometimes. but it's like an outside view, right? You dissect something or look at something from a different angle than other people, right?
Yeah.
And point stuff out. And I thought that was such an interesting comment. And so true. It's like, yeah, this is a shared experience. And then, you know, obviously Queens is the most diverse neighborhood in the world. The most languages in one area are spoken in Queens more than anywhere else in the world. And so I thought that was fitting for the place. And I just kind of tried it out. The first show I did was on Memorial Day weekend, which is in May, and the trains were down in Astoria.
Wow.
So nobody could get out of Astoria, so it was sold out. The show was sold out, although
I see,
it was the first
because
show.
everybody can't go out.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
So because the area, Astoria is kind of cut off. If the trains are down, you can't really walk to another neighborhood from Astoria. So the show was packed, and QED was like, "This is great. Keep doing it here." And I was like, "Okay, that's great." But it turns out it was, you know, mainly because the trains were down. And then it just became, I love doing the show. Then what happened was that these like 3 OverWatch fans would come to every single show. And it was these 3 guys, and they were so cute. And they would always sit in the front row, and they would laugh so hard that every single comedian that did that show was like, "This show is great," you know? Because even if like nobody would ever really bomb because of those 3 guys, and they still come. They still come.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
But I think the most amazing thing is that you respond fear by celebrating the thing that was, you know, you were pressured about being an immigrant because of Trump, but it's just it's an awesome way to respond. And how many shows have you done thus far?
I never counted, but I started in 2017, and I was doing it pretty regularly, monthly. Because I traveled, I would miss some shows, and then Tom would, before we were together, Tom and I, he would host the shows for me. And then, I only really took a break for the pandemic, I guess. So pretty much monthly since 2017. So what's that? 5 years times 12 is 60. So around 60 or 70. I also did them at the Edinburgh Fringe. I did a few Immigrant Jams. Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
By the way, if you hear us referring to Tom, I mentioned Tom several times on my YouTube. It's I know him by Tom DNYC, but it's actually Tom Delgado. Yeah, it's interesting. The first time I hear your name, you were behind the camera.
Oh, you watched one of the videos that I did.
Yeah, because he always talked to the person behind the camera.
Yeah.
How are you doing, Lucy? It's always like that, right? And so I think that was the first time. I don't know if you're already dating. It didn't sound like you're already dating.
Yes, we were dating.
Oh, you were dating.
Keeping it very professional, you know?
Yeah, but then you mentioned that you were doing Twitch when the pandemic hits, and then you liked doing it, and then you did shows similar to the Immigrant Jam podcast, but through Twitch, and then you were like, it's always a one-time thing, and then you can't listen to it again, and then
Right.
you had the idea of doing a podcast.
Yeah, I've been thinking of doing a podcast for a while, but kind of, I don't know, being a little bit standing in my own way about it, and then really also I have to give a credit to Tom. He was like, you really need to do this, and we would always kind of look around if somebody was doing it by now, and we'd be like, nobody's doing it.
Exactly.
Like, nobody's doing this idea, and I still am baffled by that.
Because you would think that, especially in New York,
right.
somebody would have the idea.
Right, exactly. And so there are like some shows that popped up since I've been doing mine with like immigrant comedians. There's one now for people on like an O1 visa, which is the alien of extraordinary ability.
That's
visa.
my visa.
Yeah, I had that too for a long time. 7 years I had that visa.
Wow.
Yeah. And stuff like that. But it's funny because a lot of the times it's kind of put into like, this is a serious subject, like immigrant. There are a lot of immigrant podcasts, but they're all like serious, you know. And for me, I first of all love, learning about different cultures. I think though that it's also like so outdated, this like concept of being just from one place, because the world is so open and sort of mixed, and I think the cross-cultural experience is, like your kids are now, whether you want it or not, going to be cross-cultural kids, like they're going to grow up with two cultures, and they're going to have that thing where they come to school and people are like, ew, what's that lunch?
Yeah.
Or, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
For example, like the little things like that, or like where it's like, okay, my dad has an accent, or where they're going to have to like translate for you if you don't understand a word, and that's a certain type of experience, and it's beautiful. And so that's why I have immigrants and then first generation immigrants on, and I just love the stories that people tell, the perspectives, and I love, and I think, for example, that this whole notion that the Trump administration put on the U.S. of, that immigrants, that people need to go back to where they came from, and that's like an artificial concept in America.
Yeah.
That's not really ever been a thing. One of the things I'll never forget moving here, which was so weird for me as a kid, was when I'd ask other kids in my class, where are you from? And they'd say, I'm a quarter Polish, In Europe, nobody does that.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I always tell people ask me back in Indonesia, back in Jakarta, how does it feel moving out to New York? And I always reply the same, like, sometimes I feel like I'm lonely because there's not a lot of Indonesian and I don't know a lot of people. But at the same time, I don't feel lonely because it feels like everybody's lonely in New York, in a sense that, I'm a Nigerian and then I'm from Argentina.
Yeah.
It's like everybody is alone, different and very
An
unique.
outsider. Yeah, for sure.
So even though we don't hang out together, just to know that everybody's different, everybody's unique, and everybody's lonely, in a way, it kind of makes you feel I'm not alone.
Yeah.
Feeling like this in New York.
Absolutely, totally. And I think that's also what's great about. I've gotten some messages from people who listen to the podcast who say like, oh, I'm like in Kansas City, and I'm from here, but there's so many things I can relate to that this woman from Japan is talking about. You know what I mean? There's so many shared experiences, because feeling like an outsider doesn't really have like, there's only the reason why you feel like it, but the feeling is
exactly
the same.
That's what makes your podcast interesting, because every time I hear anybody from whichever country they come from, it's always, whenever they say something about how they look at New Yorkers, I tend to think about, oh yeah, I kind of feel the same towards New Yorker. Or if they talk about how they were brought up in their household, and I was like, oh, that's similar, but it's kind of different, That's why it's interesting.
And then I think what becomes fun are the differences, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like there's this like baseline of like, we're the same, but it's fun to see how we're the same and different.
Yeah.
Like, So yeah, that's what I love about it too.
Oh wow, it's already 51 minutes. I promised for only 30 minutes. So I'm very sorry to take more of your time,
don't worry.
but thank you very much, Lucy.
Thank you
you
so
for
much.
having me.
Thank you. I'm sorry about the David Hasselhoff.
Yeah, she has a thing. What's with the David Hasselhoff? You said at the end of every podcast, you ask where you can find David
because
Hasselhoff.
I'm German, and so the only way to prove that I'm German is by being obsessed with David Hasselhoff.
Why is it though? I never get it.
No, it's a mystery that will never be solved. But I
Right.
did go to a David Hasselhoff concert when I was 6 years old in Hamburg, Germany. And yes, I said concert because he's famous for being a singer in Germany.
I've heard.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Lucy.
you so much for having me, and thank you
it's
for
so
doing the
great to talk
podcast.
to you. And be on the lookout for me popping up on her podcast. You can subscribe her on her YouTube, Lucy POHL. It's POHL. Also find her podcast, and I'm
like sitting here going like this.
I can't wait to be on your show.
Yeah, I
October
can't
7th.
wait.
All right. Thank you very much, Lucy.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Terima kasih udah nonton video ini dan juga terima kasih udah subscribe kanal YouTube gua. Gua mau ngasih tahu bahwa gua membuka YouTube membership dan ada 3 jenis penawaran. Ada 1 paham Rp30.000, ada 1 rasa Rp125.000, ada 1 jiwa Rp1,5 juta. Masing-masing punya manfaat-manfaat tersendiri. Ada konten-konten khusus yang gue siapkan untuk para member. Kalau tertarik silakan mampir ke home, klik join.